The forward operating base sat like a scar on the Afghan plateau, ringed by HESCO barriers and razor wire that glinted under the merciless sun. Inside the operations center, Captain Marcus Van stared at the tactical display with the kind of stillness that precedes violence. The red icons multiplying on his screen weren't supposed to be there. Not this many. Not this coordinated. The perimeter sensors had gone dark 17 minutes ago, one by one like candles snuffed by careful fingers. Now the thermal imaging showed heat signatures moving through the wadis, dozens of them, flowing toward the base like water finding cracks in a dam. Van reached for the radio handset, his knuckles white. They had 43 personnel on site, most of them support staff. 2 squads of infantry. No armor. No artillery. The nearest quick reaction force was 30 minutes out by helicopter, and the dust storm building on the horizon would ground those birds before they ever lifted off. He keyed the mic, his voice measured despite the ice spreading through his chest. Reaper 7, this is Firebase Coast Actual, requesting immediate close air support, how copy? Static crackled back. Then a voice, calm and unhurried, with the faintest trace of a southern drawl that seemed wildly out of place given what was coming. Coast Actual, Reaper 7 copies all. Currently 20 miles southeast, carrying full combat load. What's your situation? Van glanced at the display again. The red icons had stopped moving. They were in position, waiting for something, a signal maybe, or nightfall. Reaper 7, we have approximately 60 enemy personnel in assault positions around our perimeter. They've killed our sensors. We're about to get hit hard and we've got nothing heavy enough to stop them. There was a pause, barely 2 seconds, but it felt longer. When the voice came back, something had changed in it, a sharpness beneath the drawl. Understood, Coast. Reaper 7 is inbound, estimate 12 minutes to your position. Advise you get everyone inside hardened structures and mark your perimeter with IR strobes. I'll need clear lines between you and them. Van allowed himself one breath of relief, then started barking orders to his sergeants. He didn't ask who was flying Reaper 7. Didn't matter. What mattered was the Gatling gun and the Mavericks that call sign represented. What he didn't know, what none of them knew yet, was that the pilot guiding that A-10 Thunderbolt through the dust-choked air had already died once in these mountains. Her personnel file said she'd been medically retired 3 years ago after her Warthog took a shoulder-fired missile outside Kandahar. The file said she shouldn't be flying combat missions anymore. The A-10 descended through turbulence that would have turned a fighter jet into confetti, its titanium bathtub cockpit shrugging off the buffeting like a boxer absorbing jabs. Major Lydia Cahill sat forward in her ejection seat, eyes moving between the heads-up display and the brown wasteland below, searching for the firebase that was about to become a kill zone. Her left hand rested on the throttle, relaxed despite everything, while her right made constant micro-adjustments to the stick. The muscle memory was deeper than thought, older than fear. 3 years away from combat hadn't dulled it. If anything, the absence had sharpened her hunger for this precise kind of clarity, the moment when everything narrowed to altimeter readings and weapon status, and the next 30 seconds of controlled violence. Her wingman, Lieutenant Chen, flew 2,000 feet above and a mile behind, covering her 6 while she went low. He was good, fresh from Nellie's with all the latest tactics downloaded into his brain, but he'd never flown over real ground where real people were about to die if you missed. Reaper 7, Coast Actual, be advised enemy is beginning their assault. We have incoming fire from the northern ridge line. Request you prioritize that sector. Lydia toggled her radio. Copy, Coast. Northern ridge line is my first pass. Keep your heads down. She rolled the Warthog into a gentle bank, feeling the G-forces press her into the seat, watching the firebase emerge from the haze like a photograph developing. The distinctive hexagonal pattern of HESCO barriers, thin plumes of dust marking where mortars were starting to fall. And there, on the northern ridge, the flickering signatures of muzzle flashes, small arms fire that looked like fireflies from up here but was tearing through sandbags and flesh below. She armed her GAU-8 Avenger, the 7-barrel rotary cannon built into the aircraft's nose, the gun so powerful they designed the plane around it rather than the other way around. 4,000 rounds of 30mm depleted uranium waiting to be delivered at 65 rounds per second. The targeting pipper on her HUD drifted across the ridgeline as she adjusted her angle of attack. Reaper 8, hold high station and watch for AAA or MANPADS. I'm going in. Chen's acknowledgement crackled back, professional and tight. He'd asked her yesterday, over bad coffee in the operations tent, why she'd come back. Why anyone would volunteer to return to this after surviving what she'd survived. She hadn't answered then. Wasn't sure she could put it into words that wouldn't sound insane. But up here, dropping toward a firefight with her jet screaming and her finger resting on the trigger, she knew the answer. This was the only place she'd ever felt entirely herself. The first burst from the GAU-8 sounded like the world's fabric tearing, a deep BRRRRT that resonated through the airframe and made her teeth ache. The ridge line erupted in geysers of pulverized rock and red mist as 30mm rounds chewed through fighting positions at nearly 3,000 feet per second. Lydia walked the gun across the target area with surgical precision, watching through her targeting pod as figures scattered and fell, their weapons tumbling away like dropped toys. She pulled up hard, banking east to set up her next run, her G-suit inflating to keep blood from pooling in her legs. The altitude warning chirped at her. She'd gotten low, maybe too low, but the results spoke for themselves. Coast actual, Reaper 7, northern sector is suppressed. Give me your next target. Van's voice came back ragged with relief and adrenaline. Reaper 7, you're a goddamn angel. We've got more coming up the western approach. Looks like a vehicle, maybe a technical with a heavy gun. Lydia checked her fuel state. 15 minutes of loiter time before she'd need to head for the tanker. Plenty. She nosed over into another attack dive, scanning for the technical. There it was, a Toyota pickup racing across the desert floor trailing a rooster tail of dust, some kind of heavy machine gun mounted in the bed. The gunner was already swiveling toward the firebase, preparing to rake the perimeter with fire that would shred anyone caught in the open. She selected a Maverick missile, waited for the locked tone, fired. The AGM-65 dropped from her wing with a solid thunk, its rocket motor igniting a heartbeat later. The missile streaked downward, trailing white smoke, guiding itself toward the heat signature of the Technical's engine. The explosion was spectacular, a orange-black fireball that consumed the truck and everyone inside it, flipping the chassis end over end like a child's toy. Secondary explosions followed as whatever ammunition they'd been carrying cooked off. Chen's voice, slightly awed despite his training. Good kill, 7. That was textbook. She didn't respond, already scanning for the next threat. Her jaw ached. She realized she'd been clenching it, an old habit from the bad days. The ones that had ended with her aircraft spinning toward the mountains and her ejection handle the only thing between her and oblivion. The firebase sprawled below her, tiny figures moving between bunkers, the steady wink of muzzle flashes as the defenders fired back. The next 20 minutes became a rhythm of violence, a dance choreographed in gun runs and missile shots. Lydia worked the airspace above Firebase Coast like an artist with a brutal canvas, identifying threats and eliminating them with an efficiency that bordered on mechanical. But there was nothing mechanical about the calculations running through her mind, the constant assessment of fuel state versus ammunition, remaining versus enemy positions still active. Each decision carried weight, the kind that settled in your bones and stayed there long after you landed. She just completed her 4th strafing run when the radar warning receiver screamed in her headset, a shrill tone that meant someone had locked onto her with targeting radar. The threat indicator showed the source bearing northwest, probably a shoulder-fired SAM, something radar-guided rather than heat-seeking. She punched chaff, dumped countermeasures, broke hard right while simultaneously diving toward the deck. The missile must have launched because the RWR tone went continuous, tracking the threat as it climbed toward her. She counted seconds in her head, trusting her instincts more than instruments. At the last possible moment, she pulled up hard, trading speed for altitude, and the missile overshot, unable to match her turn radius. It detonated somewhere behind her, close enough that she felt the concussion through the airframe, but far enough that the titanium bathtub kept doing its job. Reaper 7 is engaged defensive, Sam launched from northwest quadrant. Her voice stayed level, professional, even as her heart hammered against her ribs. Chen came back immediately. 7, I've got eyes on the launch site, request permission to engage. Granted. 8, smoke 'em. She watched on her tactical display as Chen rolled in from altitude, his own cannon tearing into the SAM position. The threat indicator went dark. She exhaled slowly, forcing her breathing back to normal, and resumed her patrol pattern. Below, Van's voice cut through the radio chatter. Reaper 7, enemy is beginning to withdraw. You've broken their assault. We're holding the perimeter. She keyed the mic, about to acknowledge, when movement caught her eye. More thermal signatures, these ones coming fast from the east, vehicles in a convoy formation. She zoomed her targeting pod, counted 6 technicals, all loaded with fighters. The eastern convoy presented a different kind of problem, more organized than the earlier assault, moving with tactical spacing that suggested training or at least experience. Lydia climbed to 3,000 feet, giving herself room to maneuver while she assessed the situation. These weren't scattered insurgents probing for weakness. This was a reinforced assault element, probably the enemy commander's reserve force being committed now that the initial attack had stalled. She marked each vehicle on her targeting computer, prioritizing them by threat level. The lead technical mounted what looked like a DSHK heavy machine gun, Soviet-era hardware that could reach out and touch her if she got careless. The others carried troops, maybe 40 fighters total, enough to overwhelm the fire base if they made it inside the wire. Coast actual, Reaper 7, you've got 6 vehicles inbound from the east, 4 minutes out at current speed. I'm engaging now. She didn't wait for acknowledgement, already rolling into her attack dive. The lead technical grew in her HUD, the gunner swiveling his weapon skyward as he spotted her incoming. Too late. She fired a Maverick, watched the missile guide true, then broke left to avoid the debris cloud. The technical vanished in a flash of light and twisted metal, the heavy gun cartwheeling through the air to land 30 yards away. The convoy scattered, drivers slamming brakes and cranking steering wheels as they tried to disperse, but they were in open ground with nowhere to hide. Lydia selected her gun and came around for a strafing pass that cut through the second vehicle like paper, the 30mm rounds walking from engine block to cargo bed in a straight line of destruction. Bodies tumbled out, some moving, some not. She pushed away the part of her brain that wanted to think about that too closely. Chen engaged the third vehicle with his own gun, his attack angle perfect, his burst control textbook. The technical died in a shower of sparks and flame. 3 down, 3 to go. Lydia's fuel warning light illuminated, amber for now, but it would go red soon. She checked her weapon's status. 1 Maverick remaining, maybe 800 rounds of 30mm, enough to finish this if she didn't waste shots. The surviving technicals were running now, abandoning their assault in favor of escape. She pursued the fleeing vehicles with a predator's focus. The A-10's relatively slow speed actually an advantage now as she matched their desperate weaving across the desert floor. The fourth technical tried to hide behind a low ridge, but thermal imaging saw through that trick easily. She put her last Maverick into the rock face above it, bringing down a small avalanche that crushed the vehicle and anyone inside. 2 left. Her gun was the only weapon remaining, and the ammunition counter was dropping into the hundreds. She had to make this count. The fifth technical broke right, trying to use a dry waddy for concealment, but Lydia anticipated the move and cut it off with a burst that shredded the cab and sent the vehicle tumbling down the ravine in a cloud of dust and fire. The final technical, the smartest of the bunch, stopped completely and disgorged its passengers, the fighters scattering in all directions on foot. They knew what she knew, that the A-10 was built to kill vehicles and harden targets, that dismounted infantry presented a more difficult problem, smaller thermal signatures, more ability to blend with the terrain. But Lydia had been doing this a long time, longer than her official records suggested if you counted the months of unauthorized sim time during her medical retirement. The midnight sessions where she'd flown combat scenarios until her eyes burned and her hands cramped. She came in low and fast, using her targeting pod to identify who was carrying weapons versus who was running empty-handed. The rules of engagement were clear. She fired in controlled bursts, conserving ammunition, each shot deliberate and final. The gun fell silent. The desert fell silent, Chen's voice quiet with something like reverence. 7. That was the most surgical close air support I've ever seen. The fire base is secure. Enemy is broken. Lydia pulled up and away, climbing toward the tanker track where a KC-135 was orbiting with fuel she desperately needed. Her hands were shaking slightly on the controls now, adrenaline debt coming due. She flexed her fingers, rolled her shoulders, tried to settle the electricity still coursing through her nervous system. Reaper flight, good kills all around. Let's get some gas and head home. Below, Firebase Coast was already launching a patrol to secure the perimeter and account for enemy casualties. The tanker was a beautiful sight, a KC-135 stratotanker droning through the clear air at 25,000 feet, its refueling boom extended like a metal proboscis waiting to mate with her aircraft. Lydia maneuvered into position behind and below the larger plane, matching its speed while the boom operator talked her in with practiced efficiency. Reaper 7, you're cleared to pre-contact position. Looking good from up here. She inched forward, feeling the turbulence from the tanker's wake buffet her aircraft, making tiny corrections with the stick until the boom's guide lights showed green. The boom lowered and locked into her refueling receptacle with a solid clunk that resonated through the airframe. Jet fuel began flowing, thousands of pounds of JP-8 that would give her the endurance to make it back to base with reserves. She held position in the tanker's slipstream, her muscles working against the constant small disturbances, a physical meditation that required absolute focus. Chen took fuel after her, his approach slightly less smooth but still well within parameters. When both warthogs were topped off, they dropped away from the tanker and formed up for the flight home, two sharks cruising through empty sky. The radio crackled with a new voice, operations back at Bagram. Reaper 7, Bagram Command. We've received preliminary battle damage assessment from Firebase Coast, confirming 6 vehicles destroyed, estimated 40 to 50 enemy KIA, friendly casualties 0. Outstanding work out there, Major. Lydia acknowledged with a brief transmission, not trusting herself to say more. The post-mission crash was starting, that hollow feeling in her chest that always followed combat, the come-down from hyper-awareness back to normal human consciousness. It felt like falling or maybe like landing too hard. Chen's aircraft rode her wing, his canopy visible when she glanced right, his helmet silhouetted against the sky. He'd been skeptical when she'd first returned to active duty, she knew. They all had been. The medical review board's approval had come through official channels, but that didn't stop the whispers in the squadron-ready room, the speculation about whether someone who'd been grounded for PTSD should really be strapping into a combat aircraft again. She'd proven them wrong today, but she knew how this worked. Bagram Air Base materialized through the heat shimmer, a sprawling complex of runways and hangars and living quarters carved into the Afghan desert like a piece of America transplanted wholesale to Central Asia. Lydia brought the A-10 into the traffic pattern, calling her position to the tower, feeling the familiar weight of the aircraft settle around her as she bled off airspeed. The landing was smooth, main gear kissing asphalt followed by the nose wheel, her hand already on the throttle bringing the engines back to idle. She taxied to the revetment where her crew chief waited, a young staff sergeant named Tors who treated the Warthog like it was his personal responsibility to keep it flying. He marshaled her into position with crisp hand signals, then gave her the cutthroat gesture to shut down engines. The turbofans spooled down with a descending whine. Silence rushed in to fill the space they'd occupied, broken only by the tick of cooling metal and the distant sound of other aircraft on the flight line. Lydia went through her shutdown checklist by memory, fingers moving across switches and buttons with the efficiency of long practice. She safed her ejection seat, disconnected her oxygen and communications, released her harness. The canopy opened with a hydraulic hiss, admitting a wall of heat that made her eyes water. Torres appeared beside the cockpit with the crew ladder, his face split in a grin that suggested news traveled fast on a military base. "Ma'am, everyone's talking about what you did at Coast. They're calling it the best CAS mission of the deployment." She climbed down the ladder, her legs stiff from sitting in the ejection seat for the past 3 hours, and accepted her helmet bag from Torres. The firebase is still standing. That's what matters. But she couldn't help the small smile that tugged at her mouth. Validation felt good, even when you knew you shouldn't need it. Chen landed 2 minutes behind her, his own crew chief guiding him into the adjacent revetment. When he climbed down from his cockpit, he walked over to where Lydia stood doing her post-flight inspection, running her hands along the airframe to check for damage. "You're going to be a legend after this," he said, and there was no mockery in his voice now, just simple statement of fact. The debriefing took place in the Squadron Operations Center, a climate-controlled building that felt arctic after the furnace heat outside. Lydia sat at a conference table across from the intelligence officers and mission commanders, walking them through every detail of the engagement while Chen sat beside her, adding his perspective from the high station. A recording officer typed everything into a classified database, creating the official record that would eventually filter up through command levels and maybe, if the mission was significant enough, reach all the way to the Pentagon. Major Carson, the squadron commander, listened with his arms crossed and his expression carefully neutral. He was a solid officer, fair in his way, but Lydia knew he'd been one of the skeptics when she'd returned. Not hostile exactly, just uncertain about whether someone with her history should be flying combat missions. The doubt had been there in his eyes during her requalification flights, in the way he'd assigned her milk runs and CAP missions instead of the high-tempo strike packages. Today had changed something in that equation. "Walk me through your decision to engage the Eastern convoy without waiting for additional air support," Carson said, his tone suggesting genuine interest rather than criticism. Lydia pulled up the tactical replay on the flat-screen monitor mounted on the wall, freezing it at the moment she'd identified the 6 vehicles. "Time was the limiting factor, sir. The firebase had already taken casualties from the initial assault. If I'd waited for additional assets, the convoy would have been inside the perimeter before anyone could engage. I assessed that my weapons load was sufficient for the threat, and that my wingman could cover me against any additional SAM launches." Carson nodded slowly, his fingers drumming once on the table. "You were right, but you cut it close on fuel." "Yes, sir, but I made it to the tanker with reserves." "Barely." He let the word hang in the air between them, then his expression softened fractionally. "Still, you saved 43 lives today, Major. That counts for something. That counts for a lot." The intelligence officer cleared his throat, drawing their attention to a series of photographs he'd spread across the table. They showed the aftermath of Lydia's gun runs, the destroyed vehicles, the cratered fighting positions. In one image, a heavy machine gun lay bent and blackened. The debriefing concluded an hour later with Carson's final assessment entered into the record, a formal commendation that would go into Lydia's personnel file, alongside all the other accumulated paper that defined a military career. She walked out of the operations center into the late afternoon heat, squinting against the sun that hung low and angry over the mountains to the west. Her flight suit was still damp with sweat, the fabric clinging to her shoulders and back. She needed a shower, food, maybe 6 hours of unconsciousness if her brain would allow it. But first she had to attend to ritual. She walked back to the flight line where Torres was still working on her aircraft, the crew chief now joined by a team of maintenance technicians who were examining the battle damage. The A-10 had taken hits during the engagement, small-caliber rounds that had punched through the right wing and tail section without hitting anything critical. The plane was designed for this, built to absorb punishment and keep flying, every system redundant or reinforced or both. Lydia ran her hand along the fuselage near the nose, feeling the slight roughness where the paint had been scorched by muzzle flash. "How bad is it, Torres?" The crew chief looked up from where he was examining a hydraulic line, his hands covered in grease. "Nothing we can't fix overnight, ma'am. Maybe a day if we need to replace the hydraulic coupling. She'll be mission-ready by tomorrow evening." Lydia nodded, feeling a complicated mix of relief and something harder to name. The aircraft was more than a machine to her, more than the sum of its titanium armor and depleted uranium rounds. It was the shell she climbed into when she needed to become something more than herself, the exoskeleton that let her be the pilot she'd always known she could be. Without it, she was just Lydia Cahill, a woman with a medical file thick enough to disqualify her from everything she cared about. With it, she was Reaper 7, death from above, the difference between a firebase holding and a firebase dying. She left Torres to his work and headed toward the living quarters, passing groups of personnel who looked at her with a new kind of recognition. Word had spread fast, the way it always did on a military base where news was currency and heroics were rare enough to be remarkable. The shower was cold by the time she made it to the facilities, the hot water already claimed by earlier users, but Lydia didn't mind. The frigid spray shocked her system awake, washing away the accumulated sweat and fear and adrenaline residue. She stood under the stream with her eyes closed, letting the water drum against her skull, and tried not to think about the faces she'd seen through her targeting pod. The fighters scattering from the final technical. The way some of them had fallen when her gun found them. The rules of engagement had been clear, the threat had been real, but that didn't make the killing easy. It never had. That was one of the things they didn't tell you in flight school, that taking a life from 3,000 feet was supposed to be easier than doing it face-to-face, but somehow ended up feeling exactly the same when you were alone in the dark. She talked to the therapist about this during her medical evaluation, the woman with kind eyes and a notepad who'd spent 6 months determining whether Lydia was psychologically fit to return to combat. The conclusion had been yes, with caveats, with regular check-ins and mandatory counseling sessions, and an understanding that some wounds never fully healed. They just learned to stop bleeding. Lydia had agreed to all of it, signed the papers, submitted to the monitoring, because the alternative was a desk job somewhere safe where she'd slowly lose her mind. She dressed in clean utilities and made her way to the dining facility, a cavernous space filled with long tables and the smell of industrial cooking. The line was short at this hour, most personnel having eaten earlier. She loaded her tray with protein and carbohydrates, food as fuel rather than pleasure, and found a quiet corner away from the main crowds. She'd gotten halfway through her meal when Chen appeared, his own tray balanced in one hand. "Mind if I join you?" She gestured to the empty seat across from her, and he sat, arranging his silverware with the precision of someone who'd been trained to maintain order in all aspects of life. They ate in companionable silence for a few minutes before he spoke again. "I talked to some of the guys who have been deployed here for a while. They said what you did today, the way you worked that airspace, they've never seen anything like it." Chen's words hung in the air between bites of tasteless chicken and reconstituted vegetables. Lydia kept her eyes on her tray, not ready to accept the praise but not willing to deflect it either. She'd learned that about combat, that the moment you started believing you were invincible was the moment you made the mistake that got you killed. Humility wasn't just virtue, it was survival. "I got lucky," she said finally, which was partly true. Luck had put her in the right place at the right time, had made the enemy SAM operator miss his first shot, had kept her fuel from running out 30 seconds before the tanker appeared. But luck only carried you so far. The rest was training and instinct, and the kind of muscle memory that came from flying the same aircraft for so many hours it became an extension of your nervous system. Chen shook his head, rejecting her modesty. "That wasn't luck, that was skill. The way you managed your weapons, your fuel state, the way you prioritized targets and adapted when the situation changed. That was art." She looked up at him then, studying his face for signs of sarcasm or mockery, but found only genuine admiration. It was strange, this sudden reversal from skepticism to respect, strange enough to make her uncomfortable. She'd gotten used to being doubted, had built her entire return to service around the assumption that she'd have to prove herself repeatedly, that every flight would be an audition, and every mistake would be magnified through the lens of her medical history. Being accepted, being celebrated even, required a different kind of adjustment. "You did good work up there too," she offered, and meant it. Chen had held his position perfectly, had engaged when needed and stayed clear when appropriate, had been exactly the kind of wingman you wanted in a fight. He smiled, pleased but trying to hide it. "I just followed your lead. You made it easy." They finished their meals in silence, each lost in their own processing of the day's events. When Chen left to check on his aircraft, Lydia remained seated, nursing a cup of coffee that tasted like it had been brewed sometime during the previous administration. The dining facility was nearly empty now, just a few late stragglers and the kitchen staff beginning their evening cleanup. She should sleep, she knew. Tomorrow would bring new missions, new threats. Sleep proved elusive. Lydia lay in her rack in the female officer quarters, staring at the ceiling panel 3 feet above her face and listening to the bass settle into its nighttime rhythm. Generators hummed. Somewhere distant, a helicopter was running maintenance checks, the rotors creating a rhythmic thump that vibrated through the walls. Her mind replayed the mission in fragments, not the clean tactical sequence she described in the debriefing, but the chaotic sensory overload of the actual experience. The way her stomach had dropped when the SAM locked on. The sight of the technical exploding in slow motion, frame by frame as the Maverick struck home. The brief glimpse she'd caught through her targeting pod of a face looking up at her, young, terrified in the instant before her gun erased it. She rolled onto her side, pulled her thin pillow over her head, tried to will her brain into shutdown mode. Didn't work. Never did after combat. The therapist had warned her about this, the way adrenaline lingered in your system long after the threat had passed, keeping you wired and alert for dangers that no longer existed. The solution was supposed to be breathing exercises, progressive muscle relaxation, maybe a prescribed sleep aid if things got bad enough. Lydia had rejected the medication option. She needed to stay sharp, couldn't afford the mental fog that came with pharmaceutical assistance. So instead she lay there, breathing slowly, counting backwards from 1,000, doing all the tricks that sometimes worked and sometimes didn't. Around 0200 hours, she gave up and swung her legs out of the rack. She dressed quietly, not wanting to wake the other 2 women who shared the quarters, and slipped outside into the night. The air was cooler now, almost pleasant, the desert giving up the heat it had absorbed during daylight. Stars crowded the sky in numbers impossible to see back home, undimmed by light pollution. She walked toward the flight line, drawn by the need to see her aircraft, to confirm that it was real and intact, and would be there when she needed it again. Torres was gone, his shift ended hours ago, but the maintenance area was still illuminated by work lights. The A-10 sat in its revetment like a patient waiting in an examination room, partially disassembled as the night maintenance crew worked on replacing the damaged hydraulic coupling. Lydia stood at the edge of the work area, not close enough to interfere but near enough to watch. One of the technicians noticed her, a senior airman whose name tape read RODRIGUEZ. He nodded respectfully but didn't stop working, his hands moving with the confidence of someone who knew his job intimately. She watched them work, finding something meditative in their methodical approach, the way they consulted technical manuals and spoke to each other in the shorthand of shared expertise. This was a different kind of flying, a different kind of skill, but no less vital. Without these specialists keeping the aircraft airworthy, she was just a pilot with no plane, all the training in the world rendered useless by a failed hydraulic line or a cracked turbine blade. Rodriguez finally straightened, wiping his hands on a rag, and walked over to where she stood. "Can't sleep, ma'am." Something like that. He glanced back at the aircraft, then at her, and seemed to make a decision. "I was on the firebase detail last year before I cross-trained into maintenance. Coast, actually. Different rotation, but same dirt, same enemy. I know what it costs to keep a position like that from being overrun." Lydia wasn't sure what to say to that, so she stayed quiet, letting him continue. "What I'm saying is, the work you did today, it matters. It's not just statistics and kill counts. It's people going home to their families instead of going home in boxes. So thank you." She nodded, her throat suddenly tight. This was the part of military service they also didn't talk about much, the weight of gratitude, the way being thanked for killing people created a cognitive dissonance that sat in your chest like undigested food. She'd saved lives today. She'd also ended them. Both things were true and neither canceled out the other. "Your aircraft will be ready by 1800 tomorrow," Rodriguez said, shifting back to professional mode. "We're replacing the coupling and patching the wing damage. She'll fly like nothing happened." The next morning brought a sandstorm that grounded all flight operations and turned the sky the color of old brass. Lydia spent the enforced downtime in the squadron-ready room, catching up on paperwork and the mundane administrative tasks that accumulated during deployment like dust in corners. Flight hour reports, training certifications, equipment inspection logs, all the bureaucratic overhead that kept the military machine functioning. Around mid-morning, the squadron operations officer, Captain Diaz, stuck his head into the ready room and gestured for Lydia to follow him. "Colonel wants to see you," he said, his expression carefully neutral in that way that could mean anything from a commendation to a court-martial. Lydia saved her work and followed Diaz through the warren of connected buildings that made up the squadron headquarters, trying to read the situation from context clues. The colonel's summons could be routine, a post-mission check-in to ensure she was handling the stress appropriately. Or it could be something else, a concern about her methods, a question about her decisions. She'd been second-guessed before by commanders who thought her aggressive flying style indicated poor judgment rather than calculated risk. Colonel Mathers was behind his desk when she entered, a lean man in his mid-50s with iron-gray hair and the weathered face of someone who'd spent decades in cockpits. He'd flown F-16s in the Gulf War, transitioned to the A-10 later in his career, and had the kind of combat experience that meant when he spoke about close air support, people listened. He gestured for her to sit, and she did, keeping her spine straight and her expression neutral. "Major Cahill, I've been reviewing the gun camera footage from your mission yesterday," Mathers began, and Lydia's stomach tightened fractionally. Gun camera footage showed everything, every shot, every miss, every decision made in the heat of combat. It was the unblinking eye that captured the truth beyond the official reports. "Yes, sir." Mathers turned his monitor so she could see it, queued up a segment showing her fourth strafing run, the one where she'd gotten dangerously low to ensure accuracy. "This pass here, you were at 300 feet AGL, well below our standard attack profile. Walk me through your thinking." Lydia watched the footage play out, seeing herself through the external camera perspective, the dropping like a falling stone toward the ridge line, the gun beginning to fire, the target dissolving under the impact of 30mm rounds. She remembered that moment with crystalline clarity, the way time had seemed to slow down, the way she'd known exactly how low she could go and still have enough altitude to pull out of the dive. The enemy had taken position in a defile that gave them defilade from higher attack angles, she said, keeping her voice steady and professional. "If I'd maintained standard attack altitude, my rounds would have impacted the ridge line above their position without achieving effects on target. The firebase was taking effective fire from that position. I assessed that the risk of flying low was justified by the certainty of eliminating the threat." Mathers nodded slowly, his expression revealing nothing. "And the SAM engagement that followed, you think they were waiting for you to get low?" "Possibly, sir. Or they acquired me as a target of opportunity. Either way, the countermeasures and defensive maneuvers were effective." "Effective," Mathers repeated, and now the faintest hint of a smile touched his mouth. "You made that missile look like it was standing still. I've watched this footage 6 times now, and I'm still not entirely sure how you avoided it." Lydia allowed herself a small breath of relief. This wasn't a reprimand. This was something else, maybe respect, maybe recognition. "Training, sir, and a little luck." Mathers closed the video file and leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers in front of his face. "I'm going to be honest with you, Major. When you first returned to the squadron, I had doubts. Your medical file, the circumstances of your previous grounding, the time away from combat operations. I wondered if you still had the edge, if the edge had ever really been there, or if your reputation was built on myth." He paused, letting that sink in. Lydia kept her face neutral, but inside she felt the old anger kindling, the frustration of being constantly questioned, constantly required to prove what should have been accepted at face value. Mathers continued, unaware of or unconcerned by the tension he'd created. "Those doubts are gone now. What you demonstrated yesterday was exceptional pilot skill combined with tactical awareness and combat instinct that can't be taught. You saved that firebase, and you did it with the kind of flying most pilots couldn't replicate if they tried." He opened a folder on his desk, pulled out a single sheet of official letterhead. "I'm recommending you for the Distinguished Flying Cross. The paperwork will take time to process, but the recommendation is going up the chain today." Lydia felt something shift inside her chest, a loosening of tension she hadn't realized she'd been carrying. The Distinguished Flying Cross was one of the highest awards for aerial achievement, reserved for missions that demonstrated heroism or extraordinary achievement while participating in aerial flight. It wasn't about validation exactly, but it was proof. Documented official proof that she belonged here, that her return to service was justified, that all the doubt and skepticism had been wrong. "Thank you, sir. I'm honored." "You earned it," Mathers said simply. He slid another document across the desk, this one a mission briefing for tomorrow's sorties. "Weather is supposed to clear by tonight. When it does, I'm putting you on the schedule for a strike package hitting a Taliban compound in the Korangal Valley. High-value target, expected heavy resistance. I'm assigning you as package commander." Package commander meant she'd be responsible for coordinating multiple aircraft, integrating different mission elements, making tactical decisions that affected not just her own survival but the success of the entire operation. It was a position of trust, a recognition that her judgment was sound. "I won't let you down, sir." "I know you won't." Mathers stood, signaling the end of the meeting, and extended his hand. She shook it, feeling the firm grip of a fellow warrior, someone who understood what it cost to do this work. When she left his office, the sandstorm was still raging outside, but somehow the world seemed brighter. She walked back to the ready room where Chen was studying maps of the Korangal Valley, preparing for the mission she'd just been assigned to lead. Chen looked up when she entered, reading something in her expression. "Good meeting. The colonel recommended me for a DFC," she said, and then felt immediately awkward about sharing it like she was bragging. But Chen's face split into a genuine smile, the kind that reached his eyes. "That's outstanding, completely deserved." He returned his attention to the map, tracing elevation lines with his finger. "I heard about the Korangal mission. Heavy terrain, lots of places for them to hide AAA and MA and PADS. It's going to be a different kind of fight than yesterday." Lydia pulled up a chair beside him, studying the topographical map that showed the valley as a series of concentric elevation lines, each one representing 50 feet of altitude change. The Hindu Kush Mountains rose like walls on either side of the valley, creating a natural funnel that limited their approach options. The Taliban knew this terrain intimately, had been fighting in these valleys for generations. They'd know exactly where to position their weapons for maximum effect. "We'll go in at dawn," she said, thinking out loud, planning the mission in real time. "Low light will make it harder for them to track us visually, and we'll have the sun at our backs on the ingress. Two-ship formation, you run high station again while I go low for the strike. Fast movers will hit the compound with JDAMs first, soften up the hardened structures, then we come in behind them for cleanup with the gun." Chen nodded, making notes on his kneeboard. "What about our egress route? That valley is a fatal funnel if they have anything waiting for us on the way out." "We don't egress through the valley. We climb straight up and over the ridgeline, use the terrain to mask us from any ground fire. It's going to be a high-G pull, but the Hog can handle it. And if we take damage, then we handle it. That's what the redundant systems are for." She said it with more confidence than she felt, because the truth was that even the A-10's legendary survivability had limits. Take enough hits in the wrong places and no amount of titanium armor would save you. They spent the rest of the afternoon wargaming the mission, identifying potential threats and planning responses. going through the careful calculus of aerial combat that tried to account for every variable while acknowledging that combat never went according to plan. By the time the sun set and the sandstorm finally began to abate, Lydia felt as prepared as she was going to get. She ate a quick dinner, checked in with Tors to confirm her aircraft was mission-ready, then retreated to her quarters for whatever sleep she could manage. This time, exhaustion won over adrenaline. She fell into a dreamless sleep that lasted 6 hours, waking to her alarm at 0400 with her mind clear and her body rested. She dressed in the dark, not wanting to wake her roommates, and made her way to the operations center for the final briefing. The room was crowded with pilots and weapons systems officers from multiple squadrons, the strike package including not just the A-10s, but also F-16s carrying precision-guided munitions and an AC-130 gunship that would provide overwatch. The mission commander, a lieutenant colonel from the F-16 squadron, walked them through the timeline and target description. The compound was a fortified structure in the upper Korangal Valley, suspected to house a high-level Taliban commander and his security element. Intelligence suggested between 20 and 30 armed fighters on site, along with possible heavy weapons including anti-aircraft guns. The F-16s would strike first with 2,000-pound JDAMs, guided by coordinates from a special forces team on the ground nearby. The goal was to collapse the main structures and neutralize the majority of the threat. Then Lydia's element would come in behind them to destroy any remaining vehicles and suppress any surviving fighters who tried to escape. The AC-130 would orbit at altitude, ready to provide additional fire support if the situation deteriorated. Row is weapons-free on any military-age males carrying weapons in the target area, the mission commander said, and there was a heaviness to his words that suggested he understood the implications. Lydia listened, made notes, asked clarifying questions about fire support coordination procedures. When the briefing concluded, she gathered Chen and they walked together toward the flight line where their aircraft waited under the stars. The pre-dawn air was cold enough to see breath, a sharp contrast to the daytime heat that would arrive in a few hours. Lydia went through her pre-flight inspection with Tors, checking control surfaces and weapons loads and all the mechanical details that made the difference between a functional combat aircraft and a 40,000-pound paperweight. Her loadout today was 4 Mavericks, a full load of 30mm ammunition, and wing tanks for extended range. Heavy, but she'd flown heavier. Tors helped her into the cockpit, handing up her helmet and helping her connect to the aircraft systems. "Bring her back in one piece, ma'am," he said, and it wasn't clear whether he meant Lydia or the A-10. Maybe both. "That's the plan, Tors." She went through the start sequence, watching gauges come alive and systems run through their self-checks. The twin turbofans spooled up with a rising whine that she felt through the seat, a vibration that meant power, readiness, lethality. Chen's aircraft lit up a minute later in the adjacent revetment. They taxied to the runway together, 2 dark shapes moving through the pre-dawn gloom, and waited for clearance. "Reaper Flight, you're cleared for takeoff," the tower controller said, his voice crackling through her headset. Lydia pushed the throttles forward, felt the acceleration press her into the seat, watched the airspeed indicator climb through rotation speed. She pulled back on the stick, and the A-10 lifted away from Earth with surprising grace for something so brutal in purpose. Chen formed up on her wing as they climbed toward the mission altitude, 2 hunters heading toward the mountains. The sky was beginning to lighten in the east, painting the Hindu Kush in shades of purple and gold. Below, Afghanistan spread out like a rumpled blanket, beautiful and deadly. The radio crackled with reports from the forward air controller embedded with the Special Forces team near the target. His call sign was Python 6, and his voice carried the particular calm of someone who'd done this many times before. "Reaper 7, Python 6, target area is quiet at this time. No observed enemy movement. Recommend you hold its station while the fast movers make their run." Lydia acknowledged and entered a racetrack holding pattern 20 miles from the target, throttling back to conserve fuel while the F-16s made their approach. She couldn't see them from her position, but she could hear their pilot chatter on the common frequency, terse confirmations and weapons release calls. Then a pause. Then Python 6's voice, tight with excitement. Good hits, primary structure is destroyed. I have multiple secondary explosions, possible ammunition cook-off. Shifting observation to the vehicle park. Lydia checked her tactical display, counting down the seconds until it was her turn. The valley was still dark, the sun not yet high enough to illuminate the deep cuts between mountains. She'd be going in under marginal visibility conditions, relying on her targeting pod and night vision to identify threats. Not ideal, but combat rarely was. Reaper 7, Python 6, you're cleared hot. I have 3 vehicles attempting to flee the compound via the northern trail, marked with IR pointer. Lydia rolled into her attack heading, dropping toward the valley floor at a steep angle that would have terrified a civilian pilot. The targeting pod showed the fleeing vehicles as bright spots in the darkness, their engines glowing in infrared. She selected a Maverick, waited for lock tone, fired. The missile leapt from her wing and streaked toward the lead vehicle, trailing smoke that glowed faintly in the pre-dawn light. Impact. The vehicle exploded, blocking the trail. The other 2 vehicles slammed on their brakes, trying to reverse course, but they were hemmed in by rock walls on either side, sitting ducks. She switched to her gun, came around for a strafing run, and walked 30mm rounds across both vehicles in a steady stream of destruction. The GAU-8's roar echoed off the valley walls, a sound like the world ending. Reaper 7, 3 vehicles destroyed. I have personnel fleeing on foot into the tree line northeast of the compound. Lydia pulled up hard, climbing to avoid the ridgeline that was rushing up to meet her. The G-forces crushed her into the seat, narrowing her vision to a tunnel. She fought through it, keeping her breathing controlled, and leveled out at 5,000 feet. Chen checked in, his aircraft orbiting above the valley providing overwatch. The fleeing fighters scattered into the tree line presented a tactical dilemma that Lydia had encountered before. The question of proportionality and necessity that sat at the intersection of military effectiveness and moral restraint. The rules of engagement authorized her to engage armed enemy combatants fleeing the target area, but the trees made positive identification difficult. She could see thermal signatures moving between the pines, could see some of them carrying what looked like weapons, but the targeting pod's resolution at this range wasn't perfect. She made a decision, the kind that would be reviewed later in after-action reports and maybe questioned by people who weren't there. She selected a clear area on the western edge of the tree line where several signatures were clustered, armed herself with another Maverick, and fired. The missile impacted 20 feet from the nearest target, close enough that the overpressure and shrapnel would be lethal but far enough that it wasn't a direct hit. A warning shot with teeth. The effect was immediate. The thermal signatures scattered deeper into the forest, moving fast, no longer trying to fight. She watched them go, tracking their movement but not engaging further. They were neutralized as threats, unable to regroup or mount a counterattack, and that was sufficient. Killing them now would be efficient but not necessary, and Lydia had learned to recognize that distinction. Python 6, Reaper 7, fleeing personnel have dispersed into heavy terrain. They no longer pose an immediate threat to your position. Python 6 rogered the transmission, then added, "Appreciate the restraint, 7. We've got friendlies in the area conducting follow-up operations." That confirmed her decision was right, or at least defensible. Chen came on the internal frequency, his voice meant only for her. That was good judgment. A lot of pilots would have pressed the attack. Lydia didn't respond, already scanning for new threats, new complications. The compound was still burning below, smoke rising in a column that would be visible for miles. The F-16s had done their job thoroughly, reducing the main structure to rubble. Her job was cleanup, making sure nothing escaped that might reconstitute later. The AC-130 orbiting above the valley had been silent until now, but suddenly its pilot came on the radio with an urgency that made Lydia's attention snap to full alert. "All aircraft, Spooky 3-1, I have IR signatures of a large group moving toward the compound from the east, approximately 40 personnel, heavily armed, designating as hostile." Lydia checked her tactical display, saw the new threat icon appear like blood spreading across a map. 40 fighters was more than a cleanup force, more than stragglers from the compound. This was a reinforcement element, possibly a quick reaction force that had been staged nearby in case of exactly this kind of strike. If they reached the Special Forces team's position, the mission would shift from successful strike to desperate rescue. Python 6, Reaper 7, can you confirm Spooky's contact? There was a pause, then Python 6 came back with controlled tension in his voice. Confirmed, 7. We have eyes on approximately 36 fighters moving fast through the valley floor. They're between us and our extraction point. We're going to need immediate fire support or we're not getting out of here. Lydia's mind accelerated into combat calculus, running through options and outcomes with the speed of long practice. She had 2 Mavericks remaining, full gun load, maybe 20 minutes of fuel before she'd need to head for the tanker. Chen had his full loadout still, having stayed high during her initial attacks. The AC-130 had its fearsome array of weapons, but was vulnerable if the enemy force had any shoulder-fired SAMs. Reaper 8, Reaper 7, I'm going to hit them from the south while they're still in the open valley. You set up north and cut off any escape route. Spooky, can you provide illumination? The AC-130 pilot acknowledged, and seconds later a flare blossomed in the sky above the valley, turning night into harsh daylight. The enemy force was suddenly exposed, caught in the open ground they'd been using for speed. Lydia saw them scatter, diving for whatever cover they could find, but the valley floor offered precious little. She rolled in from the south, selected her gun, and began what would later be described in the mission report as sustained close air support under heavy fire. The valley floor erupted in tracers as the enemy force opened up with everything they had, multiple machine guns and small arms turning the air into a constellation of glowing rounds that curved past Lydia's aircraft like malevolent meteors. She ignored them with the practiced detachment of someone who understood that most bullets missed, that the A-10's armor could handle the ones that didn't, and that fear was a luxury she couldn't afford in the middle of a gun run. The GAU-8 spoke its violent language, and the valley floor answered in dust and bodies, and the particular chaos that 30mm high-explosive rounds created when they met flesh. Lydia walked the gun across the enemy formation with methodical precision, not spraying randomly but selecting targets deliberately. Groups clustered together, machine gun positions, anyone who looked like they were coordinating the others. The ammunition counter in her HUD dropped steadily. She pulled off target and climbed, breathing hard now, her G-suit inflated tight around her legs and abdomen. Chen was rolling in from the north, his own gun run cutting off the enemy's retreat exactly as planned. The coordination was beautiful in its lethality, 2 aircraft working the same target area from different angles, creating a kill box that nothing could escape from intact. Reaper 7, Python 6, enemy force is broken and retreating. You've cleared our extraction route. Outstanding work. But Lydia wasn't done. She'd seen something during her gun run, caught a glimpse through her targeting pod of a figure standing apart from the others, not running but directing, pointing, clearly in command. Taliban commanders were high-value targets worth the risk of one more pass. She called it to Chen. 8, I'm going back in. I have a possible high-value target on the eastern edge of their formation. 7, your Winchester on Mavericks and you've burned through half your gun load. Recommend we let Spooky finish them off. It was good advice, tactically sound, the kind of conservative approach that kept pilots alive. Lydia considered it for 2 seconds, then rejected it. -8, one more pass, cover me. She dove back into the valley with the kind of aggressive flying that separated the competent from the exceptional, dropping below the ridgeline in a way that made the terrain itself cover against any SAMs the enemy might have brought. The targeting pod showed her target still standing, still gesturing to his scattered fighters, trying to impose order on chaos. She armed the gun, adjusted her angle of attack, and fired a burst that should have torn him apart. Should have. But the 30mm rounds impacted the ground in front of him, kicking up a wall of dirt and rock that obscured her view. When the dust cleared, he was moving, wounded maybe but still alive, being dragged away by two of his fighters toward the tree line. Lydia's ammunition counter showed red. Empty. She'd expended her entire combat load and the primary target was still breathing. It felt like failure, even though intellectually she knew the mission was successful, the SF team was safe, the enemy force was destroyed as an effective fighting unit. But that one man escaping felt personal, felt like something left unfinished. Reaper 7, Spooky 3-1 will take it from here. Your bingo fuel, RTB, returned to base. The two most beautiful and most bitter words in military aviation. Beautiful because it meant you'd survived. Bitter because it meant the fight went on without you. Lydia acknowledged and climbed out of the valley, chin forming up on her wing. They turned south toward Bagram, leaving the burning compound and the scattered bodies behind. The sun was fully up now, painting the mountains in shades of rose and gold that would have been breathtaking if Lydia had any attention left for beauty. But her mind was still in the valley, still watching that Taliban commander being dragged to safety, still calculating what it would have taken to finish the job. Chen's voice brought her back. 7. That was some of the most aggressive CAS I've ever witnessed. You saved those guys on the ground. The mission was successful, Lydia said, which wasn't the same as agreeing with his assessment but was all she trusted herself to say right now. They flew in silence for a while, eating up the miles between combat zone and safety. The landing at Bagram was routine, if anything about military aviation could be called routine. Lydia brought the A-10 down with the precision of long practice, greased the landing despite her fatigue, and taxied to the revetment where Torres waited with his usual crew. But when she shut down the engines and climbed out of the cockpit, she saw something different in his expression, a kind of awe mixed with concern. "Ma'am, your aircraft took multiple hits. Did you know?" Lydia walked around to inspect the damage and felt her stomach drop. The right wing was perforated with small-caliber holes, at least a dozen of them that she could see without even looking closely. The tail section showed impact damage. One of the engine nacelles had a crease that suggested a round had come very close to penetrating something critical. She'd been too focused on the mission to notice, too committed to the fight to register that people were shooting back effectively. Torres ran his hand along the wing, shaking his head. "You got lucky, ma'am. A couple of these hits were inches from fuel lines, if any of them had connected." He didn't need to finish the sentence. Lydia knew exactly what happened when fuel lines ruptured during combat, had seen the gun camera footage from other pilots who hadn't been as lucky. You became a fireball, a statistic, a name added to a memorial wall. How long to repair? Torres consulted with his maintenance team, examining each hole, making notes on a clipboard. 48 hours minimum. We're going to have to replace damaged skin panels, check all the underlying systems, do a complete functional check before she's airworthy again. 2 days. 2 days where Lydia would be grounded while her aircraft underwent repairs. 2 days of watching other pilots take missions that should have been hers. The frustration must have shown on her face because Torres added gently, "Ma'am, if it's any consolation, the fact that she brought you home with this much damage just proves why the A-10 is the best close air support platform ever built." He was right, objectively, but it didn't make the grounding any easier to accept. Lydia thanked him and headed toward the debrief, already dreading the questions about why she'd taken so many hits, whether her aggressive tactics had been necessary or just reckless. The debriefing was more intense than after the coast mission, partly because more aircraft had been involved, and partly because the enemy resistance had been heavier than anticipated. The intelligence officers wanted every detail about the Taliban reinforcement force, their equipment, their tactics, their apparent level of training. The mission commander wanted to understand the coordination between the different aircraft elements, what had worked and what needed improvement. And Colonel Mathers, sitting in the back of the room with his arms crossed and his expression unreadable, clearly wanted to assess whether Lydia's flying had crossed the line from aggressive to suicidal. She walked them through her decisions methodically, explaining the tactical logic behind each choice, presenting the gun camera footage that showed the threats she'd engaged and the effects she'd achieved. When she got to the final pass, the one where she'd tried to kill the enemy commander despite being low on ammunition and taking effective fire, the room went quiet. Mathers leaned forward. "Major, at that point in the engagement, you'd already accomplished the mission objective. The Special Forces team's extraction route was clear. What was your operational justification for making another attack run?" Lydia had known this question was coming, had prepared her answer during the flight back to base. "Sir, the individual I targeted appeared to be directing the enemy force. Eliminating him offered the opportunity to further degrade their command and control, potentially preventing them from regrouping and threatening other friendly forces in the area." It was a good answer, technically correct, the kind of response that checked all the boxes in the tactical decision-making matrix. But Mathers wasn't buying it. She could see that in his eyes. He'd been a combat pilot long enough to recognize the difference between tactical necessity and personal drive. "Major Cahill, you're one of the finest CAS pilots I've ever seen," he said, and there was no warmth in the compliment, just statement of fact. "But you're also starting to develop a pattern of pressing attacks beyond the point of diminishing returns. That concerns me." The room was silent now, everyone watching to see how this would play out. Lydia held Mathers' gaze, refusing to look away even though every instinct screamed at her to show deference, to acknowledge his concern with appropriate subordinate humility. But she'd spent too many years being questioned, having her judgment doubted, being told she was too aggressive or too damaged or too much of a risk. Something had calcified inside her during those years, a core of certainty about who she was and what she could do that wouldn't bend anymore, not even for a colonel she respected. "Sir, with respect, every decision I made was calculated to achieve mission success while managing acceptable risk. The A-10 is built to take damage. I used that capability to accomplish the mission." Mathers studied her for a long moment, and Lydia couldn't read what was happening behind his eyes, whether he was angry or impressed or some combination of both. Finally, he nodded slightly. "You did accomplish the mission and you brought your aircraft back. That counts for something. But I'm scheduling you for a 48-hour stand-down while your aircraft undergoes repairs. Use that time to decompress, Major. That's not a suggestion." It was a dismissal, professional but firm. Lydia acknowledged and left the debriefing room, feeling Chen's concerned glance on her back as she went. Outside, the midday heat hit her like a physical force. She walked toward the living quarters, not really seeing where she was going, her mind replaying the conversation with Mathers and finding new angles of attack, better arguments she should have made, ways she could have defended her actions more effectively. The truth was, Mathers wasn't entirely wrong. She had been pressing harder than strictly necessary, taking risks that served no purpose beyond proving to herself that she could. The therapist would call it compensatory behavior, trying to make up for the 3 years of forced retirement by being more aggressive than required. The problem was, Lydia didn't know how to fly any other way. The middle ground between excessive caution and measured aggression was where most pilots lived, but she'd never found that space comfortable. She was either all in or she was useless, either committed completely to the violence of combat or she should be flying a desk somewhere safe. The forced stand-down gave Lydia 48 hours to think, which was possibly the worst thing Colonel Mathers could have mandated. Without missions to plan or aircraft to fly, her mind turned inward, picking at questions that had no good answers. She spent the first day sleeping off the accumulated fatigue, her body finally claiming the rest it had been denied. When she woke in the late afternoon, the female officer quarters were empty, her roommates out on their own duties. She lay in her rack staring at the ceiling and listening to the bass sounds filter through the walls. Evening came. She forced herself to the dining facility, ate mechanically, returned to her quarters. The second day was worse. She tried to occupy herself with email, with professional development reading, with maintenance reports on her aircraft. But her thoughts kept circling back to the Taliban commander who'd escaped, to Mathers' assessment that she was pushing too hard, to the fundamental question of why she'd come back to this life, when she could have stayed retired with her pension and her relative safety. The medical discharge 3 years ago had been presented as a kindness, a recognition that she'd given enough, that no one could fault her for accepting that the shoulder-fired missile that had destroyed her previous aircraft had also destroyed her ability to function in combat. The flight surgeon had been gentle about it, explaining that PTSD wasn't weakness, that her symptoms were normal reactions to abnormal stress. The therapist had been equally kind, validating her feelings while helping her understand that some doors close and you have to find new ones. Lydia had tried to accept it, had tried to build a civilian life teaching aviation safety at a small college in Tennessee, had tried to find satisfaction in classroom discussions and grading papers, and the simple rhythm of a world where nobody shot at you. She'd lasted 11 months before the suffocation became unbearable. The civilian world felt like living in a dream, everything muffled and distant and fundamentally unreal. She'd wake up reaching for flight controls that weren't there, her hands grasping empty air. She'd watch the news about Afghanistan and feel her chest tight with the knowledge that people were fighting and dying while she was safe. The path back to active duty had been neither easy nor straightforward. A bureaucratic maze of medical reviews and psychological evaluations and command approvals that had taken nearly a year to navigate. Lydia had approached it with the same relentless focus she brought to combat flying, treating each obstacle as a target to be acquired and destroyed. The flight surgeon who'd initially grounded her had retired, replaced by a younger doctor who looked at her case with fresh eyes and saw that her symptoms had resolved, that whatever trauma had broken her had also healed. The therapist had been more cautious, insisting on 6 months of regular sessions before she'd sign off on Lydia's return. They'd talked about triggers and coping mechanisms, and the difference between being technically capable and being psychologically ready. Lydia had said all the right things, demonstrated all the proper insights, passed every assessment. But she'd also held back the core truth, the thing she couldn't admit to the therapist or the flight surgeon or anyone else. She needed combat the way some people needed alcohol or drugs, needed the clarity and purpose and absolute presence that only came when death was a possibility measured in seconds rather than theoretical decades away. The civilian world was a gray space where nothing mattered enough to justify the effort. Combat was vivid, three-dimensional, real in a way that everything else felt like shadow. Admitting that would have ended her return to service before it started would have been flagged as exactly the kind of unhealthy attachment that indicated she wasn't ready. So she'd kept it hidden, performing the role of the recovered warrior who'd found balance and perspective. And maybe she had, in some ways. She didn't have nightmares anymore, didn't flinch at loud noises, didn't experience the hypervigilance and emotional numbing that had characterized her worst months. But she also knew that the healing was incomplete, that she'd simply learned to function with the damage rather than actually repairing it. Now, lying in her rack at Bagram while her aircraft underwent repairs, Lydia wondered if Mathers had seen through the performance, if he recognized that her aggressive flying wasn't just confidence but compensation, need disguised as skill. On the morning of the third day, Torres found her on the flight line inspecting her repaired aircraft. The maintenance team had worked through the night to patch the bullet holes and replace damaged components, and the A-10 now sat in its revetment looking almost pristine, the new skin panels slightly different in shade from the weathered gray of the original fuselage, but functionally perfect. "She's ready to fly, ma'am," Torres said, handing Lydia the maintenance logbook with all the sign-offs and inspections documented in meticulous detail. "We replaced the right wing leading edge, patched 17 separate penetrations, replaced hydraulic lines in 2 locations, and did a complete engine inspection. She's actually in better shape now than before the mission." Lydia ran her hand along the new panels, feeling the smooth metal cool against her palm. This aircraft had saved her life, absorbing damage that should have been lethal and bringing her home anyway. The A-10 was ugly and slow and had been scheduled for retirement more times than anyone could count, but it did one thing better than any other aircraft ever built. It kept its pilot alive while they delivered violence on target. "Good work, Torres. Thank you." He nodded, pleased with the recognition, then hesitated. Ma'am, if you don't mind me asking, what's it like? When you're taking fire and you know rounds are hitting your aircraft but you have to stay focused on the mission. It was a surprisingly vulnerable question from a maintainer, someone who worked on these machines but never flew them into combat. Lydia considered lying, giving him some sanitized answer about training and professionalism. But Torres deserved better than that, deserved the truth. It's terrifying, she said simply. Every instinct is screaming at you to break off, to get out of the engagement, to save yourself. But you can't because people are depending on you to do your job, so you just compress the fear into something small enough to ignore, and you focus on the next thing and the thing after that until the mission is complete. And then later, when you're safe, the fear catches up with you. Torres absorbed that, his young face serious. That takes courage, ma'am. No, Lydia corrected gently. Courage is doing it the first time when you don't know if you can. After that, it's just stubbornness. Colonel Mathers cleared Lydia for flight status that afternoon, and she was immediately added to the next day's mission schedule, a routine combat air patrol over the Helmand province that should involve minimal contact. Milk run duty, the kind of mission you gave to pilots who were returning from stand-down, low risk and low stress. Lydia accepted the assignment without comment, recognizing it for what it was. Mathers testing her, seeing if she'd push too hard on a simple mission or if she could dial back her aggression when the situation didn't demand maximum violence. She briefed with her assigned wingman, a captain named A-10 who'd been in country for 6 months and had a reputation for solid, unspectacular flying. They walked through the mission parameters, established communication protocols, reviewed the rules of engagement. A-10 treated her with a deference that suggested he'd heard about Coast and the Korangal Valley, that he understood he was flying with someone whose reputation exceeded his own experience. The next morning brought clear skies and calm winds, perfect flying weather. Lydia strapped into her aircraft with Torres assisting, went through the pre-flight checks with mechanical efficiency, and taxied to the runway feeling the familiar anticipation building in her chest. This was what she'd been missing during the stand-down, this moment of transition between ground and sky, between safety and purpose. The takeoff was smooth, the aircraft responding to her inputs with the precision of a well-maintained machine. A-10 formed up on her wing and they climbed toward their patrol altitude, leaving Bagram behind as they headed southwest toward Helmand. The radio chatter was minimal, just occasional check-ins with the airborne controller who was managing the battle space. Below, Afghanistan scrolled past in shades of brown and gray, the occasional green valley marking where rivers or irrigation brought life to the desert. From this altitude, it was almost possible to forget that people were fighting and dying down there, that the peaceful-looking villages housed combatants and the empty wadis hid weapons caches. Reaper 7, Overlord, we have reports of suspicious activity in grid November Whiskey 4273. Multiple vehicles, possible enemy movement. Requesting you investigate and report. Lydia checked her tactical display, marked the grid coordinates. The grid coordinates led them to a cluster of compounds 30 miles south of their current position, deep in territory that had contested control, where Taliban and Afghan government forces traded dominance based on time of day and current force positioning. Lydia descended to 15,000 feet, high enough to avoid small arms fire, but low enough that her targeting pod could get detailed imagery. The vehicles were there, 4 of them parked in a rough semicircle outside the largest compound. From this altitude, it was impossible to determine if they were hostile or just civilian traffic. Afghanistan was full of Toyota pickups and old cargo trucks that looked identical to the technical vehicles the Taliban used. The rules of engagement required positive identification before engaging, something more than just suspicious positioning. Overlord, Reaper 7, I have visual on 4 vehicles at reported location. Unable to confirm hostile intent at this time. Request guidance. There was a pause while the controller consulted with whatever intelligence sources fed into his decision matrix. Lydia orbited above the compound, watching through her targeting pod as figures emerged from the buildings and began loading items into the trucks. Weapons maybe, or supplies, or just their personal possessions. The resolution wasn't good enough to tell. Akoi checked in on their discrete frequency. 7. What are you thinking? I'm thinking we need better information before we start shooting at people who might be civilians. Even as she said it, she recognized the irony. 2 days ago she'd been criticized for being too aggressive, and now here she was being cautious, second-guessing what her instincts suggested might be a legitimate target. The pendulum swung both ways, and finding the center point was harder than anyone acknowledged. Overlord came back with authorization to conduct a show of force, a low pass designed to intimidate and observe reactions. If the people below were Taliban, they'd likely scatter or start shooting. If they were civilians, they'd probably just watch in fear and confusion as military aircraft roared overhead. Lydia acknowledged and rolled into a shallow dive, descending toward the compound at a steep enough angle to be intimidating, but not so steep she'd be committed if things went wrong. The A-10 dropped through 10,000 feet with its distinctive silhouette growing larger in the compound below, the twin engines and straight wings and prominent nose gun making it instantly recognizable to anyone who'd ever been on the receiving end of close air support. Lydia kept her finger near the trigger but not on it, watching the targeting pod display for reactions. The figures below scattered, running for cover in a pattern that suggested training rather than panic. One of them raised what looked like a weapon, pointing it skyward. That was enough. Overlord, Reaper 7, taking effective fire from the compound, engaging hostile targets. She pulled up from the show of force pass and came around for a gun run, arming the GAU-8 while simultaneously checking that Akoi was clear of her attack line. The compound grew in her HUD, the vehicles now clearly visible, armed figures moving between them. She fired a burst that walked across the vehicle park, destroying 2 trucks in a shower of sparks and twisted metal. Secondary explosions suggested they'd been carrying ammunition or fuel. The remaining fighters opened up with everything they had, tracers arcing into the sky in desperate patterns that looked more defiant than accurate. Lydia ignored them, already setting up her next pass, when Akoi's urgent voice cut through her focus. 7. Brake right, you've got a missile launch. She broke hard, dumping chaff and flares while simultaneously diving for the deck, the missile warning receiver screaming in her headset. The SAM was radar-guided, sophisticated, probably something the Taliban had acquired from Iran or Russia. It tracked through her first evasion, forcing her to execute a series of violent maneuvers that grayed out her vision and made her G-suit inflate to crushing tightness. The missile detonated somewhere close. She felt the concussion, but the A-10's armored bathtub absorbed the shrapnel. Then Akoi was rolling in from altitude, his gun tearing into the SAM position, silencing it permanently. Lydia leveled out at 2,000 feet, breathing hard, and keyed her mic. Good kill, Akoi. That was a righteous save. His acknowledgement came back shaky with adrenaline. For him, this was probably his first real combat engagement, his first time watching a missile try to kill his flight lead. For Lydia, it was Tuesday. The engagement escalated from there, more fighters emerging from the compounds, more weapons revealing themselves as the situation developed from simple reconnaissance into a full combat action. Lydia worked the target area with methodical precision, destroying vehicles and weapons positions, while Akoi provided high cover and called out threats she couldn't see from her lower altitude. The coordination was good, better than she'd expected from someone she'd just met, and she made a mental note to commend him in the after-action report. 20 minutes into the fight, Overlord's voice cut through the tactical frequency with new information that changed everything. Reaper 7, be advised, we have friendly forces in contact 2 miles north of your location. They're taking heavy fire and requesting immediate assistance. Lydia checked her fuel state. She had maybe 15 minutes before she'd need to head for the tanker, and splitting her attention between 2 fights was a good way to make fatal mistakes in both. But the request for assistance meant American or Allied troops were in danger, and that overrode every other consideration. Overlord, Reaper 7 is proceeding to friendly position. Akoi, finish up here and then join me north. She pulled off target and turned north, already scanning for the new engagement area. It appeared on her tactical display as a cluster of infrared strobes marking friendly positions, surrounded by a swarm of heat signatures that could only be enemy fighters. A lot of them, more than she'd faced at any single point during this deployment. The radio crackled with a new voice, strained and urgent. Any aircraft, this is Titan 2-6. We are danger close with approximately 100 enemy personnel. We have wounded, we're almost out of ammunition, and we need fire support immediately. 100 enemy fighters. Lydia felt something cold settle in her stomach, the recognition that this was going to be bad regardless of how well she flew. But the alternative was abandoning friendlies to die, and that wasn't acceptable. Titan 2-6, Reaper 7 is inbound, 90 seconds out. Mark your position with IR strobes and get everyone under hard cover. This is going to be close. The scene that materialized through Lydia's targeting pod was chaos given form. A small Afghan village transformed into a battlefield where American forces had been pinned down by a Taliban force that outnumbered them 10-1. She could see the friendly position, a cluster of mud brick buildings on the western edge of the village, marked with IR strobes that glowed bright in her thermal imaging. And surrounding them, flowing through the streets and compounds like water finding cracks, the enemy force. They were assaulting in waves, using fire and maneuver tactics that suggested professional military training rather than the usual insurgent approach. Titan 2-6 came back on the radio, his voice hoarse from shouting orders. Reaper 7, we need you to hit the eastern compound. That's where their command element is positioned. They're coordinating the assault from there. Lydia identified the target, a larger structure with what looked like a radio antenna on the roof. Armed figures were moving in and out, clearly using it as a headquarters. The problem was the proximity to friendly forces. The eastern compound was maybe 200 meters from the American position, well within the danger-close range where her 30mm rounds could cause fratricide if she made even a small error. Titan, confirm you're willing to accept danger-close fire support. Affirmative, 7. We're dead if you don't engage, and we're maybe dead if you do. I'll take those odds. It wasn't authorization exactly, more like desperate acceptance of terrible options. Lydia armed her gun and rolled in from the south, setting up an attack angle that would send any rounds that missed the target into the empty desert beyond, rather than toward the friendly position. She'd have one chance to get this right. The compound grew in her HUD as she descended, her finger resting on the trigger, waiting for the precise moment when the targeting pipper aligned with the building and her dive angle was optimal. She fired. The GAU-8 roared and the eastern compound vanished in a cloud of pulverized mud brick and dust. The radio antenna toppled. Secondary explosions suggested she'd hit something volatile, ammunition or fuel. She pulled up hard and broke left, checking for threats. The destruction of the command compound had an immediate effect on the enemy assault, the coordinated waves faltering into confused clusters as fighters lost their direction. Lydia used that moment of disorganization to press her advantage, coming around for another gun run that targeted the largest concentration of enemy forces she could identify without endangering friendlies. The 30mm rounds chewed through the village streets, each impact creating a small crater and a rapidly expanding cloud of dust and debris. Bodies fell, others scattered. The Taliban force was breaking, their numerical advantage meaningless against an A-10's firepower. Akoi arrived overhead, his aircraft carrying a full weapons load since he'd spent less time engaged at the southern compound. 7. I've got eyes on enemy forces trying to flank the friendly position from the north. Request permission to engage. Granted. 8. Keep your impacts at least 100 meters from the strobes. She watched on her tactical display as Akoi rolled in and delivered his own gun run, precise and controlled, exactly where it needed to be. The flanking movement died in a hail of 30mm fire. Titan 2-6's voice came back, strained but carrying a note of relief that bordered on euphoria. Reaper 7, enemy is withdrawing. You've broken their assault. We've got wounded, but everyone's alive. I don't have words for what you just did. Lydia didn't respond immediately, too busy scanning the village for any remaining threats, any enemy fighters who might be regrouping for another attempt. But the thermal signatures were all moving away from the American position now, fleeing into the surrounding desert and the safety of distance. The fight was over. Titan, glad we could help. Get your wounded stabilized and prepare for CASEVAC. Overlord Reaper 7, requesting medevac bird for Titan's position, multiple wounded, grid to follow. She climbed away from the village, her fuel state finally hitting critical, the amber warning light on her instrument panel reminding her that she needed to find the tanker soon or she'd be landing on fumes. A koi formed up on her wing and they turned east toward the tanker track, leaving the battlefield behind. The flight back to Bagram after refueling was quiet, both pilots too exhausted and too wired to make small talk. Lydia ran through the mission mentally, cataloging her decisions, identifying places where she could have been more efficient or more effective. The engagement at the southern compound had been straightforward, textbook even, but the danger-close support for Titan 26 had pushed right up against the edge of what was tactically sound versus what was just desperate. If she'd been off by even a few feet, if the wind had shifted at the wrong moment, if her targeting solution had been slightly miscalculated, she would have killed the people she was trying to save. That reality sat heavy in her chest, mixing with the satisfaction of knowing they'd survived because of her actions. Combat was like that, triumph and horror occupying the same space, making it impossible to feel purely good or purely bad about anything. Bagram appeared in the distance, the familiar pattern of runways and buildings that meant safety and debriefing, and the start of the administrative aftermath. Lydia brought the A-10 down smoothly despite her fatigue, the muscle memory of thousands of landings guiding her through the pattern. Torres was waiting at the revetment, and when he saw the new battle damage more bullet holes, these ones concentrated around the engine nacelles, his expression suggested he was running out of shocked reactions. "Ma'am, you're going to put my kids through college with all the overtime this aircraft generates." Lydia climbed down from the cockpit, her legs unsteady on the crew ladder. "Sorry, Torres, I'll try to get shot at less." "Please don't. I mean, please do. I mean." He trailed off, clearly unsure how to express that he valued the job's security while also genuinely wanting her to stop returning with combat damage. She understood the sentiment completely. The debriefing was already being set up when she entered the operations center, the intelligence officers and mission commanders assembling with the kind of energy that suggested they knew something significant had happened. Colonel Mathers was there too, his expression unreadable as Lydia took her seat, and prepared to walk them through another mission that had escalated beyond its original scope. The debriefing lasted 3 hours, every detail of both engagements picked apart and analyzed. The intelligence officers were particularly interested in the SAM that had engaged her at the southern compound, wanting to know everything about its radar signature and flight characteristics. The mission commander wanted to understand her decision-making at the village, the calculations that had led her to accept danger-close fire support. And Colonel Mathers just listened, his face giving away nothing, until the formal debriefing concluded and everyone else filed out. Then he gestured for Lydia to remain seated. "Major Cahill, I'm recommending you for another DFC. What you did today at that village, saving Titan's element, that was exceptional work under the most difficult circumstances possible." Lydia waited for the other shoe to drop. There was always another shoe. "However," Mathers continued, and there it was, "I'm also concerned that you're developing a pattern of seeking out the most dangerous assignments, of pushing into situations that would make other pilots back off. 3 major engagements in less than a week, all of them involving high-risk tactics and close calls. That's not sustainable, Major." He wasn't wrong. Lydia knew she'd been threading needles, taking risks that added up over time even if each individual decision seemed justified. But she also knew that the alternative was the slow suffocation of safety, the gradual loss of the sharp edge that made her effective. "Sir, every mission I've flown has been assigned through normal channels. I haven't sought out dangerous situations, they've just developed that way. And when they develop, you engage instead of calling for backup. You press attacks when you could break off. You accept danger-close fire support when other pilots would refuse. Mathers leaned forward, his voice dropping to something quieter, almost paternal. Lydia, I flew combat missions for 20 years. I know what it's like to feel invincible, to think that your skill will always be enough to overcome the odds. But I also buried friends who thought the same thing right up until the moment they were wrong. The use of her first name, the shift from professional to personal, caught her off guard more than any criticism could have. Mathers wasn't finished, his weathered face showing genuine concern rather than command authority. I've read your full medical file, Major. I know what you went through 3 years ago, the ejection, the recovery, the medical discharge. I know how hard you fought to get back here. That kind of determination is admirable, but it can also become destructive if you're trying to prove something that doesn't need proving. Lydia felt her defenses rising, the familiar walls she'd built during her medical evaluation process. Sir, with respect, my psychological fitness has been thoroughly evaluated. I've been cleared for combat operations. Being cleared for combat and being healthy in combat are different things, Mathers said gently. You're one of the finest pilots I've commanded, maybe the finest. But you're also running yourself into the ground, and I can't let that continue. So here's what's going to happen. You're taking 7 days of leave, effective immediately. That's an order, not a suggestion. You're going to leave Bagram, go to Qatar or Dubai or anywhere that doesn't involve flying combat missions, and you're going to decompress. The words hit Lydia like a physical blow. Leave. 7 days away from her aircraft, from the mission, from the only thing that made sense. She wanted to argue, to explain that leaving now would be worse than staying, that the empty time would just give her more space to think about the things she was trying to outrun. But the look on Mather's face told her this wasn't negotiable. Yes, sir, she managed, her voice flat. I'll submit my leave request today. Already submitted. Your flight to Qatar leaves tomorrow morning. Use the time, Major. Read books, sleep in, do whatever normal people do on vacation. When you come back, we'll talk about your role in the squadron going forward. He stood, signaling the end of the conversation, but paused at the door. For what it's worth, I think you're going to be a legend. The pilots are already calling your missions Reaper runs because nobody comes back from the situations you engage. But legends don't do anyone any good if they burn out or get killed. So take the leave, get your head straight, and come back ready to fly for the long term, not just the next mission. The flight to Qatar was a haze of military transport and administrative processing, Lydia moving through the motions with mechanical efficiency, while her mind remained back at Bagram with her aircraft and her mission. The base at Al Udeid was massive, a sprawling complex that served as the hub for American military operations across the Middle East. It had everything a person could want for rest and relaxation. A pool, a gym, decent food, air conditioning that actually worked. Lydia hated it on sight. She checked into her transient quarters, a small room with a bed and a desk and a window that looked out on the flight line. She unpacked her limited belongings, stared at the empty hours stretching ahead of her, and felt the suffocation beginning. This was what the civilian world had felt like, this sense of purposelessness, of time passing without meaning. She lasted 6 hours in her room before claustrophobia drove her outside. The base was quieter than Bagram, less sense of immediate threat, more sense of routine operations. She walked aimlessly through the complex, past the dining facilities and recreation areas, past groups of personnel enjoying their downtime with the ease of people who weren't carrying the weight of recent combat. Near the flight line, she found herself drawn to the maintenance hangars where F-16s and F-15Es were undergoing repairs and modifications. She stood outside one hangar, watching technicians work on an F-15E that had taken flak damage over Syria, their careful attention to detail reminding her of Tor's and his dedication to keeping her A-10 flying. A voice behind her made her turn. Lydia Cahill, I heard you were here. She recognized him after a moment, Captain Rick Daniels, a pilot she'd known from her previous squadron before her medical discharge. He looked older now, the kind of aging that came from deployments and stress rather than simple years. They'd flown together on several missions, had developed the easy camaraderie of people who trusted each other's skills. Rick, didn't expect to see you here. He gestured toward the F-15E in the hangar. I'm transitioning to Strike Eagles, been here for 3 months doing the training pipeline. Heard through the grapevine that Reaper 7 was making a name for herself in Afghanistan. Took me a while to connect that call sign with you. They found a quiet corner in one of the base coffee shops, a Starbucks franchise that could have been in Seattle or Tokyo or anywhere else in the globalized American empire. Rick bought them both coffee, and they sat across from each other at a small table, the conversation starting with the easy catching up of old acquaintances before gradually deepening into more substantial territory. I heard about your ejection, back in the day, Rick said carefully. When you disappeared from the squadron, we were told you'd been medically retired. I figured that was it, that we'd never fly with you again. Lydia wrapped her hands around her coffee cup, using the warmth to ground herself. I thought so too for a while, but I couldn't make the civilian world work. Tried teaching, tried being normal, and it just felt like drowning in slow motion. Rick nodded like he understood, which maybe he did. So you fought your way back. That's impressive. Most people who get grounded stay grounded. Most people are smarter than me, Lydia said, and there was more truth in the joke than she intended. They talked about flying, about the differences between the F-15E and the A-10, about the changing nature of combat operations in an era of precision strikes and drone warfare. Rick was enthusiastic about his transition, excited by the Strike Eagle's capabilities and the missions it could accomplish. His enthusiasm was genuine and infectious, and Lydia found herself remembering what it had been like to love flying for its own sake rather than needing it the way she did now. "Can I ask you something?" Rick said after a pause. "The rumors coming out of Bagram about your missions, the danger-close engagements, the aggressive tactics, are they true? Depends on the rumor. The one where you stayed in a gun run while taking effective fire from 3 separate positions. The one where you pulled danger-close support so close they could feel your gun's concussion in their positions. The one where you refused to break off an engagement even after taking a SAM hit." Lydia considered her answer carefully. "The situations required aggressive tactics. I used the capabilities of my aircraft to accomplish the mission. That's the job." Rick studied her across the table, his expression showing concern rather than judgment. "Lydia, we flew together for 2 years before your ejection. I know how you flew then, and it was nothing like what people are describing now. You were good, maybe great, but you were also measured. You took calculated risks, not desperate ones. Something's changed." She wanted to deflect, to make a joke or change the subject, but Rick's directness had always been one of his better qualities. He'd earned honesty, even if the truth was complicated. "What's changed is that I know what I'm capable of now. I've been through the worst-case scenario, the thing every pilot fears. I ejected, I survived, I came back. That gives you a different perspective on risk. Or it makes you reckless because you think you're invincible." "I don't think I'm invincible," Lydia said, hearing the edge in her voice. "I know exactly how mortal I am. But I also know that the people on the ground depending on close air support don't care about my psychological state. They care about whether I can deliver ordnance on target when they're about to get overrun." Rick raised his hands in a placating gesture. "I'm not questioning your effectiveness. From what I hear, you're saving lives left and right. I'm questioning whether you're going to survive long enough to keep doing it." It was an echo of what Mathers had said, the same concern expressed in slightly different words. Lydia felt the familiar frustration rising, the sense that everyone was trying to protect her from herself when what she really needed was for them to trust her judgment. But another part of her, the part that had worked so hard in therapy to develop self-awareness, recognized that maybe they weren't wrong. Maybe the pattern was visible to everyone except her because she was too close to see it clearly. "My commander ordered me to take a week of leave to decompress," she said finally. "That's why I'm here instead of flying missions. So your concern is noted and apparently shared by the chain of command." Rick smiled slightly. "How's the decompression going?" "Terribly. I've been here less than a day and I'm already going stir-crazy." They talked for another hour. the conversation drifting away from combat and risk assessment towards safer topics, mutual friends from their previous squadron, changes in tactics and technology, the eternal complaints about military bureaucracy. It was pleasant, almost normal, and Lydia found herself relaxing in a way she hadn't since returning to active duty. Maybe this was what Mathers had intended, getting her away from the operational tempo long enough to remember that there was more to existence than the next mission. When they finally parted ways, Rick extracting a promise that she'd meet him for dinner later in the week, Lydia walked back to her quarters feeling fractionally less suffocated. The next few days established a rhythm. She worked out in the mornings, pushing her body through PT routines that left her exhausted enough to quiet her mind. She read in the afternoons, fiction mostly, stories about worlds that had nothing to do with military aviation. She met Rick for dinner twice, their conversations gradually moving beyond professional topics into more personal territory. He was seeing someone back in the States, a teacher he'd met during his last leave, and he talked about her with the kind of quiet hope that suggested he was thinking about futures beyond the next deployment. Lydia listened and tried not to feel envious of his ability to maintain connections to the civilian world, to care about things that existed outside the cockpit. On the fifth day of her leave, she found herself at the base library, a surprisingly well-stocked facility that served the thousands of personnel rotating through Al-Udeid. She was browsing the military history section when she encountered a book that made her freeze. The A-10 Thunderbolt II, A Pilot's Perspective. She pulled it from the shelf, recognizing the author's name, Colonel James Gunner Harrison, a legendary Warthog pilot who'd flown during the Gulf War. She'd read parts of it during her initial A-10 training, but that had been years ago, before her ejection, before her medical discharge, before her desperate fight to return. Now she opened it randomly to a chapter titled The Cost of Close Air Support and began reading. Harrison wrote about the psychological toll of flying danger-close missions, the weight of knowing that your mistakes could kill the people you were trying to save. Harrison's words hit harder than Lydia expected, each paragraph feeling like it was written specifically for her, even though the book had been published a decade earlier. He described the addictive quality of close air support, the way it became the purest expression of the pilot's purpose, the moment when training and skill and courage converged to make an absolute difference in life-and-death situations. But he also wrote about the cost, the way that addiction could consume you, until you were only fully alive in those moments of extreme danger, and everything else felt like marking time until the next mission. The best CAS pilots, Harrison wrote, are the ones who can walk the line between aggressive and suicidal, who can push the envelope without tearing it. But that line is thinner than most people realize, and it shifts depending on fatigue, stress, and the accumulated weight of past missions. I flew with pilots who were brilliant right up until the moment they weren't, who made one calculation wrong after 100 right ones, and paid the ultimate price. The key to longevity in this business isn't just skill, it's knowing when to press and when to back off, and that's something no amount of training can fully teach. Lydia closed the book and sat in the library's quiet reading area, staring at nothing in particular. Mathers had essentially told her the same thing. Rick had suggested it, and now even a legendary pilot from a previous generation was confirming what she'd been trying to deny. She was walking that line, maybe had already crossed it without realizing, and the only reason she'd survived this long was luck disguised as skill. The question was what to do with that awareness. She could dial back her aggression, fly more conservatively, accept that some missions would be incomplete because she chose caution over commitment. That was the rational choice, the sustainable approach that would let her have a long career instead of a brilliant but brief one. Or she could continue as she had been, accepting the risks as the price of being maximally effective, and trust that her skills would continue to be sufficient until they weren't. The choice felt impossible, because both options required giving up something essential. The last 2 days of her leave passed in a kind of suspended animation, Lydia going through the motions of relaxation without actually relaxing. She met Rick for dinner on the final evening, and he could clearly see that the week hadn't accomplished what Mathers had intended. "You're going back tomorrow?" he asked over mediocre Thai food in the base food court. "First flight to Bagram in the morning." Did the leave help at all? Lydia considered lying, but Rick deserved better. "It gave me time to think," which might have been the opposite of helpful. Thinking just makes everything more complicated. Rick nodded slowly, pushing noodles around his plate. "Before you go back, I want to tell you something. When I heard about your ejection 3 years ago, about the medical discharge and the PTSD diagnosis, I thought your career was over. Not because you weren't good enough to come back, but because the system makes it almost impossible to return once you've been grounded. The fact that you fought through all that and made it back to combat operations, that's extraordinary. You beat impossible odds. There's a but coming, isn't there? But don't let that victory become the thing that kills you. You proved you could return. You proved you still have what it takes. Now prove you can have a career that lasts more than 6 months before you run out of luck." It was good advice, delivered by someone who cared about her survival. Lydia thanked him sincerely, promised to stay in touch, and meant it. When she got back to her quarters and started packing for the return to Afghanistan, she tried to hold on to that advice, to let it inform how she approached the remaining months of her deployment. But underneath the good intentions, she felt the familiar hunger building, the anticipation of getting back to her aircraft and her mission, and the clarity that only came at 300 feet above hostile territory with someone shooting at her. The flight back to Bagram departed at 0600, a C-130 cargo plane packed with personnel and equipment returning from leave or transitioning between assignments. Lydia found a seat along the webbing that lined the fuselage wall. Bagram looked exactly the same as when she'd left it, which was somehow both comforting and depressing. The same heat, the same dust, the same controlled chaos of a forward operating base supporting ongoing combat operations. Torres was waiting for her at the maintenance hangar, his face lighting up when he saw her approaching. "Ma'am, welcome back. Your aircraft missed you." "How is she?" "Perfect. We've been running routine maintenance, but she hasn't flown a combat mission since you left. Colonel Mathers wanted her ready for when you returned." Lydia felt something loosen in her chest, seeing the A-10 sitting in its revetment looking pristine and deadly. This was home in a way Qatar had never been, this combination of aircraft and purpose and the immediate presence of real stakes. She ran her hand along the fuselage, feeling the cool metal under her palm, and allowed herself a moment of simple happiness. It didn't last long. She'd barely finished her reunion with her aircraft when Captain Diaz appeared, gesturing for her to follow him to the operations center. "Colonel wants to see you. He's been waiting for your return." The walk to Mather's office felt longer than it should have, giving Lydia time to wonder what this meeting would entail. A reassignment to less dangerous missions, a continued concern about her tactical approach, an evaluation to determine if the leave had accomplished its intended purpose. Mathers was at his desk when she entered, and he gestured for her to close the door and sit. His expression was serious, the kind of gravity that preceded important news. "Major Cahill, welcome back. How was Qatar?" "Quiet, sir. It gave me time to reflect on our previous conversation." "Good, because that conversation is going to continue, but first I need to brief you on the current situation. While you were gone, the operational tempo in your sector increased significantly. We've been running continuous missions, and we're starting to see signs of pilot fatigue across the squadron. I need experienced pilots who can handle high-stress missions while also serving as examples of sustainable operations." Lydia wasn't sure where this was going, so she stayed quiet and waited. Mathers pulled up a map on his computer, showing the eastern provinces of Afghanistan where Taliban activity had intensified during Lydia's absence. Red icons marked recent engagements, and there were a lot of them, concentrated in areas that had been relatively quiet for months. Intelligence suggests the Taliban is planning a major offensive before winter sets in. They're massing forces, stockpiling weapons, and probing our positions to identify weaknesses. We're going to be in a high-intensity fight for the next 6 to 8 weeks, possibly longer. I need every experienced pilot flying at peak effectiveness. He turned to face her directly. Which brings me to you, Major. You're one of the most skilled CAS pilots I've ever commanded, but you're also operating at an unsustainable pace. So here's what I'm proposing. I'm assigning you as the squadron's lead instructor for danger close tactics. You'll still fly combat missions, but you'll also be responsible for training the newer pilots in the advanced techniques that make you so effective. This serves two purposes. First, it shares your expertise across the squadron, making everyone better. Second, it forces you to think about sustainability and best practices, not just what works for someone with your particular skill set. It was clever, Lydia had to admit. Mathers was giving her a role that validated her abilities while simultaneously creating accountability, making her responsible for other pilots' safety in a way that might temper her own risk-taking. When would this start, sir? Immediately. You've got a training session scheduled for tomorrow morning with 4 of our newer pilots. After that, you'll fly a combat mission in the afternoon, putting into practice the sustainable tactics you're teaching. And Lydia, this isn't punishment or a lack of confidence in your abilities. This is me trying to keep you alive while also making the entire squadron better. Can you work with that? Lydia considered the proposal from multiple angles, looking for the trap or the limitation. But there wasn't one, not really. She